Good morning, everyone. We'll give people a few more minutes to join in and then we'll start the class. Can someone please confirm that I'm audible?
Yes, sir. We can
Okay.
hear.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, we'll give people a couple of more minutes and then we'll start. Okay, we have around 34 participants. So let's just go ahead and then get started. Good morning, everyone. This class is for MA English first year students. This is course 2 titled American Literature. I think this is the fifth class, if I'm not wrong. We've already had 4 classes. Last week, what we discussed 20th century American fiction. I'm not sure how many of you attended that class, but we talked about the writing style of two authors, Ernest Hemingway, and then we talked about Faulkner. We looked at one work of each of these authors and talked about the major themes of these works. Today, what we'll do is we will move on to American poetry. We will talk about the quintessential characteristics of American poetry, what makes poetry American poetry, and we will talk about the themes that are very predominant in American poetry. And then we'll talk about two great poets, poet and poetess, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, before moving on to contemporary American poets. Okay. Um, Before we start for today, can somebody very quickly tell us what the writing style of Ernest Hemingway is? How did he write? Was he writing in a complicated way with complex sentences, or what was his writing style? This is just to help people who have not attended the last class, because this is a very important point. Anybody who has attended the last class and then can answer this question: what is Ernest Hemingway's writing style? Okay, Asad says short and straightforward. Yes, that's how you'll have to remember it. Hemingway didn't unnecessarily complicate anything, so his writing style was very short and straightforward. Short, I think, Asad, you mean simple sentences. Okay, let's just move on to today's class then. We are in, from a text or a course book perspective, we are in block 3, unit 9. And the objectives of this unit are to first talk a little bit on general characteristics of American poetry, especially in the 19th century, and then talk about a few poets of this century. Then we will move on to Whitman and Dickinson, who we will sort of analyze, not analyze, but talk about them in a little bit more detail than the other poets. Okay, before we get into American poetry, let's go back into the second unit for a minute. Again, I don't know how many of you have attended that class, but if you remember, we talked about Native American literature, and we said that poetic form was one of the major forms of Native American literature. Now, when we talked about these in Native American literature perspective, we didn't call them poems. We called them Native American songs. Now, some Native American tribes believed that songs are a way to call upon the powers of nature. For some, it was a way of prayer. For some, it was a way to describe events in life. So basically, song was one of the major method, usually transmitted orally because I mean, they didn't have any written literature at that point in time. We've already discussed this in previous classes. Now, I'm not saying that every song is a poem, but we can roughly say that most early songs are poetic in form. I'll repeat that. Most early songs are poetic in form. That doesn't mean every song is a poem or vice versa, but most early songs, they have a poetic element in them. Now, then what happened after the Native American period? Then the European colonization of America happened in the early 17th century. And then groups like the Puritans influenced the American writing. Do you remember who Puritans were? We talked about two groups, Puritans and the Pilgrims. Anybody? Who are the Puritans?
They were Protestants.
Good. Yeah. They were Protestants, and anything more? You're right, Samira. They are Protestants, and so were the Pilgrims. But
They
what did they believe in?
um they had a strong feeling that Bible is the foremost authority, and
Mhm.
the masses conducted in the church were not appropriate.
Okay. Okay. Okay, let me put whatever you have said in a different way. Okay, they were a group of people who believed that the Church of England should be purified. That's why they are called Puritans. Okay, now what is wrong with the Church of England? They believe that the Church of England had too much of Catholicism in it, and then that it needs to be purified because these people were Protestants. Okay, they believe that this religion, whatever religion we're talking about, uh, whatever religion you follow, or here in this case it's Christianity, but they believe that religion applies to all spheres of life, not just going to church and then listening to sermon and that kind of stuff. Okay, so those are the Puritans. Now we also talked about the Pilgrims, originally from England, moved to Holland. They were afraid they will be influenced by the Dutch culture, so went on a pilgrimage to America. So that's why they are called pilgrims. Okay, they wanted to break away from the Church of England. Now the basic difference between Puritans and Pilgrims is that Puritans did want the Church of England. They wanted the Church of England, just that they wanted to purify it. Pilgrims, on the other hand, wanted to break away from the Church of England. Okay, that's the basic difference. So anyway, with the European colonization of America in the 17th century, the influence, of course, of the European or English poetic form and diction was huge on American poetry at that time. Now, I'm not sure if you are in the units that discuss British poetry, but do you know what poetic form and diction are? What is a poetic form and what is poetic diction? Anybody? Okay, no problem. Let's take a poem, and then the poem's form is the way it is structured. Okay, what does that mean? Like things like the length of the poem's lines, the stanza, how long is the stanza, the rhyme schemes, all these are part of the poem's forms. Poem's form. Okay, what it means is just the structure of the poem, however it's constructed, is the poem's form. Now, what is diction then? Poetic diction is the specific word choice meant to express certain meanings. Okay, what does that mean? The vocabulary used by the poet to form it that forms the diction. Okay. Now, it was believed that poetic diction is different from prose. Okay, if you really look at it, when I'm saying poetic diction basically means the word choice. The word choice also plays a major role in prose, right? But it was believed that diction is different from prose up until Wordsworth came along. Again, I'm not sure if you have come to the Romantic age in British literature. Wordsworth said language near to the language of men was appropriate to poetry as per prose. Okay, so anyway, you will talk about Wordsworth much more in your British class. But anyway, back to our topic. The European way of poetry influenced American poetry after colonization. One of the first poets in this time period is Anne Bradstreet. We've talked about her a little bit in Unit 2, I think, who is considered one of the early women poets who wrote in English. Now, she wrote on religious and political themes. She wrote about the Puritan values. And then I think we talked about her in block one. And then we said there is a bit of irony in what's happening with Anne Bradstreet. Why? Because Puritans did not approve of women writing. And here we are talking about a woman actually writing about Puritan values. So there's an irony with Anne Bradstreet. But just remember that she's the first women poetess of American literature. Another poet was Edward Taylor, who also wrote about the Puritan ethic. So many of the poets of the 17th and early 18th century wrote about like religion and the Puritan values because religion played a major had a major influence on the writings of that centuries. 18th century is when American poets started moving away from European themes. Why? Because America got independence in late 18th century. Then they started slowly, steadily moving away from the European themes. And they started writing about themes closer to America. What are closer to America? We'll talk in a bit. One such poet was Philip Freneau, who wrote about the Native American life. Now, on the whole, the development of American poetry reflects the development of the colonies themselves. Now, America was also colonized, just like India was colonized. The development of this American poetry kind of sort of reflects development of the colonies themselves. So we are back to this whole point that we have been continuously discussing, which is the literature is a reflection of the society. So whatever is happening in the society, whatever developments were happening in the colonies, those kind of sort of reflected in the development of American poetry also. Now, how is that? We will see. The early poetry is, like I said, dominated by the themes of Puritan ideals and religion and everything. Now, as the colonists kind of grew in confidence and the colonies developed, the poetry they wrote reflected the drive towards independence. Okay, I think it's the same with any other colony also, especially India, where the poetry of the previous centuries were discussing themes which were not predominantly related to independence. But if you see the late like 19th century and then early 20th century, the poetry and the prose, whatever we talk about in India also, were focused on independence and then freedom and freedom struggle and that kind of stuff. That was the same with US also. So the themes they wrote on changed as they got closer to the independence. That's my point. Now, moving a little further, we are talking about now after independence poetry, after the US got independence. People like William Bryant, Henry Longfellow, who else? John Whittier, and other people were called. These people are part of a group called fireside poets. Now, why fireside poets? Because their themes and their adherence to that poetic conventions, like the poetic forms, rhyming, all that we have just discussed, made these poems like a perfect poems for families to sit around a fire like fireplace, and then read these poems for the whole family for entertainment. So these people were called fireside poets because all their poems, like I said, were good entertainment for a family to sit around the fire and then read to the whole family or the group. Now, these what did they write on? They wrote on domestic life as well as the politics of the United States and then how it's changing and how the developments are happening, that kind of stuff. The other 19th century poets were Emerson and then Poe. Sidney Lanier, I didn't list him on the slide, but anyway, these are the other poets. But these poets were searching for a distinct American voice. Now, what is this distinct American voice we're talking about? A voice different from the voice that has the European influence. That is what they meant by distinct American voice. So they use this American landscape, the nature, American traditions, which formed these major themes for these people. Before talking about Emerson, we need to understand what transcendentalism is. I think we discussed romanticism when we were talking about the romantic period and or romanticism and transcendentalism. I think we did discuss what transcendentalism is. Does anybody remember what it is? What is transcendentalism? I think it was in the second or third class. Anyone who knows what transcendentalism is? In the meantime, I'll just quickly check the chat. Okay, Sujata says 10th News by Anne Bradstreet. Okay, good. Okay, Nike says no idea. Okay, transcendentalism, I just very quickly repeat what I told you in second class or third class. But transcendentalism is a philosophical movement that, from an American perspective, it developed in early 19th century in this New England area. New England is a set of 6 states in US, and these states together are called New England area. So that's why it developed there. Okay. Now the core idea is that people have knowledge about themselves and the world around them that transcends or transcends basically means goes beyond. The knowledge that we have goes beyond what the human senses can perceive. So basically what they're saying is whatever you can perceive or you can understand about yourself and whatever, there is vast knowledge beyond that. There is something beyond what we see, hear, touch, and using our five senses. That's what they're basically saying. Okay. Now, another core belief of transcendentalism is that man and nature are inherently good, like everything is good, whatever. I mean, be it creation or evolution or whatever. The belief is man and nature are inherently good, while society and institutions of society have kind of corrupted this good being. So we are born as good people, but then, society and institutions are what corrupts us. Transcendentalists also saw divine experience in the everyday stuff that happens, rather than believing that there is a heaven somewhere. They didn't say that you will die, you will go to heaven, you will die, you will go to hell. But they said God is here. There is divinity in what we do in everyday life. And one biggest characteristic of transcendentalist poets and writers is that they have a very big appreciation for nature. Now, in fact, Emerson, who is considered to be one of the first transcendentalists, wrote an essay which is titled Nature. That itself is the title. Okay. Now, another thing is this movement is also heavily influenced by Hinduism and Eastern religions. Let me put it that way. Emerson himself was heavily influenced by Hinduism. He was influenced by the Vedas, the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, everything. So anyway, Emerson championed transcendentalism. He believed that all things are connected to God and therefore all things are divine. Now, he himself wrote a lot of essays. I mentioned nature already. So he wrote other series of essays. He wrote poems like Concord Hymn, Muriel. These are listed in your course book. So please read it in Unit 9. Okay, another poet we cannot miss is Edgar Allan Poe. We have discussed this person as a short story writer in a couple of classes ago. We discussed it. But he also wrote poetry. While a lot of his contemporary poets did not like Edgar Allan Poe, we discussed the reason also because we saw in an earlier class that he gave really bad reviews of other poets and writers, so nobody liked this guy. Like, for example, he accused Longfellow of plagiarism. Longfellow is on your screen. So he accused Longfellow of plagiarism. However, he did not have a lot of influence. He did have a lot of influence on French poets like, Baudelaire, who took inspiration from Poe's work. So everybody in the US didn't have a good opinion of Poe, but then the foreign poets and foreign writers were influenced by Poe. Now, if you remember, Poe had a theory about short story. He said, it's only a short story when you can finish it in one sitting, which is approximately of 30 minutes or so. So he has developed the short story narrative, or he has developed the short story theory. Now, he also has theory on the poem side. He also had opinions on what a poem should be. Now, one of his major ideas is a poem should not be intending to teach anything. Basically, he said poem should not teach morals. Poem should not teach you a lesson. A poem should have musicality to it. It should have symbolism, but it should not teach anything. That's Poe's view, not my views. That's Edgar Allan Poe's views. He says poem should have musicality to it. It should follow a particular rhyme scheme. It should be very pleasing to ears when you hear it, but it should not have any moral. It shouldn't, at the end of the day, it shouldn't teach you anything. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Okay. Shweta says
Yes, sir.
superhuman.
Sir, what is colonial, sir?
Colonial basically means somebody. Okay. If you look at the history of India, Britishers came to India, right?
Okay.
And they made India their colony. Okay. So they colonized India. So in this context, the British are called colonizer and India is called colonized.
Okay.
Okay, so
All right.
colonialism basically is this act of going to some other place, taking away their, land, culture, everything, and then overthrowing the government that is there, and then quote unquote ruling them over. That's colonialism.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Shweta says superhuman. Shweta, can you please explain what are you talking about? Are you talking about transcendentalism? Okay, so let me rephrase. Okay, transcendentalism is not actually superhuman. Okay, superhuman basically is you're talking about superhuman abilities, right? Like Batman, Spider-Man. These people are Iron Man. These people are superhuman because they do things that humans cannot do. Transcendentalism is not talking about superhuman abilities. The whole philosophical movement is talking about the fact that there is knowledge which is beyond human. Okay, we are not doing any superhuman activities. They are basically saying there is knowledge that we cannot understand as humans. So if anything, it's the kind of sort of opposite of superhuman, where they are saying you're human and your knowledge is limited. There's so much more that you don't know. That's what they're saying. Okay. Okay, good. Can we move on?
Yes, sir.
Oh, all right. Now let's slowly come to the second half of the 19th century. We will talk a bit about two writers, Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Two extremely different writers. Whitman's style is completely different from Dickinson's style, but we will see what links them later. Now, let's first talk about Whitman. Whitman is from the time where he's kind of sort of in between transcendentalism and realism. Okay, so he is not fully into transcendentalism and not fully into realism. He's sandwiched in between. Now, so his work has aspects of both these movements. This is why, he has influence from both these movements. He's really famous for this collection of poems called Leaves of Grass. I think it's listed on your screen. It was first published in 1855, but one peculiarity about this work is Whitman kept revising it. He kept rewriting parts of it until his death. So he's worked on it really, really for a long time. So there have been like multiple editions of this collection. And the first edition had about 12 poems or something, 12, 13 poems or something. And the last one had over 350 poems. So you can imagine how much Whitman worked on this in his life. There's another peculiarity, which is this collection of poems kind of reflect Whitman's philosophy of life, and it praises nature and man's role in it. Rather than focusing on religious or spiritual matters, this particular work, Leaves of Grass, focuses on the body and the material world. Okay, if you look at transcendentalism, what is it saying? It's not saying, it's not talking about the body and material world. It is saying, there are things that transcend this material world and bodily world. What is realism saying? Does anybody know what realism is? It's actually what it means. I mean, the word means. What is realism?
A move against romanticism.
Okay, good, but it is. You're right, Pujita. It is a move against romanticism, but what is it though? What does it say?
Realism is works on facts.
Very good. Okay, yeah. Okay. So they're talking about, okay, Asad says talking about reality. Yeah, perfectly put. They are basically talking about reality. What is reality? Whatever we see, whatever we perceive with our five senses, right? So this collection, again, like I said, it was not focusing that much on religious or spiritual matters, but then on the body and the material world, which is the realistic world, quote unquote. Okay. So now, another peculiarity about this collection is it was considered very obscene and offensive at Whitman's time because it has an overload of sexual imagery in this collection. Okay, he writes a lot about, sensuality, and sexual imagery is a lot in this particular volume or collection. Now, during this time, talking about sex and sexuality was considered immoral, and Whitman did exactly that. He talked about things that are, not really appreciated at that time. Anyway, he also talked about a lot about American sensibilities, to even such a level that Ezra Pound, another writer, said Whitman is America's poet. He is America. And that's what Ezra Pound says about Whitman. So basically, what he's saying is Whitman defines America. That's what he says. He's so American that he is the one who defines America. Okay, that's fine. That's Ezra Pound's opinion on Whitman. But what does Whitman himself say about America? That's what we'll have to think about. Whitman basically says that each person has a role and a voice that is individualistic. Now, if you will have to remember that America as a society is very individualistic. Individualism comes on top for them. Okay. Now, he says every person has a role and voice that is individualistic, that belongs only to that person. But when added to the roles and voices of all other Americans, it forms America. So Whitman is being very optimistic, let me put it that way here. Why? Because the voices of all other Americans will not match. Okay, everybody has their individual opinion. But Whitman is being very optimistic, and then he says even though we have a voice which is individualistic, you combine that with all other voices of the country, and then it forms America. That's what Whitman is saying. Okay, that's good. But what did he write about? His major themes were nature, friendship, democracy, love, sexuality, death, immortality. I mean, these were his. We will talk about immortality. I'm sorry, death in a little bit in one of his poems. But your course book, if you look at the unit, it lists a few of Whitman's poems like "Song of Myself," "Crossing Brooklyn Ferry," and one of the most important and most famous ones, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." That's a poem that is really famous. Now, this poem is a elegy to President Lincoln. What's an elegy? Does anybody know what an elegy is? Anyone? What's an elegy? Okay. Elegy is a poem of mourning. Okay. So when someone dies and then a poet writes a poem in remembrance of this dead person, then the poem is called an elegy. Okay. Now, who died and how is this an elegy? President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, president of the US, died. And then this is Whitman's poem, which is an elegy written on Lincoln. Okay. Now, one thing that sets Whitman apart is the style of the poems. He is considered to have used free verse. Okay, again, what is free verse? In your British literature, you might have read what is free verse. Anybody? What is free verse? Okay. Am I still audible, or am I just talking to myself?
Yes, Sajid.
Yes,
Okay,
sir. Voice is audible.
okay. Does anybody know what free verse is? What is free verse in poetry? Sujata says does not rhyme. Very good. Yes. It's not just the rhyme, Sujata. Okay, I will take off from what Sujata is saying. Okay. You're right. It is not poetry that doesn't rhyme, but it also does not have a meter. So there is no particular rhyme scheme or the meter. Okay, that's good. But what are rhyme scheme and meter? The rhyme scheme is just the pattern of rhymes. Rajni, we will come to your comment about freedom to say anything. But okay, it has no rhyme scheme and meter. So what are rhyme schemes and meters? Rhyme scheme is just the pattern of rhymes or sounds at the end of each line. If you see most poems, they rhyme at the end, right? The last word kind of rhymes in every line or every other line or something like that. That is the rhyme scheme. Meter is a little bit more complicated. Meter is the rhythmic structure of the lines in a poem. Okay, yeah, Sujata, you're right. Meter is the rhythm. Okay, what does that mean? It is this, you have stressed and unstressed syllables in a line that forms the meter of the poem. Okay, for now, it's a little bit complicated. So for now, remember that meter and rhyme schemes are aspects of poetry that define how a poem is written. Okay, if you talk about any poem, it usually has a rhyme scheme. It usually has a rhythm to it or a meter to it, except when it is written in free verse. Okay, so going back to free verse doesn't have any specific rhyme scheme. It does not have any specific meter. It is written freestyle. Okay. Now coming back to Rajni's comment about freedom to say anything, that is there in any poetry, not specifically free verse. Okay. The freedom to say anything is there in any creative art form, not even specific to poetry. So that has nothing to do with free verse. Okay, so just highlighting that freedom to say anything is there in any creative art form. It is nothing specific to free verse. Free verse basically means there is no specific rhyme scheme, there is no specific meter. Okay. Okay, now we will talk about the elegy that Whitman wrote after President Lincoln. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, the whole poem is given in your, I think at least half of it is given in your book. This poem is written in free verse and it has like, I think 205 lines or 207, 206 lines or something like that. It's over 200 lines. Now we know that this was an elegy for Lincoln, but Whitman himself does not name Lincoln specifically in this poem at all. If you read all 206 lines or 205 lines, you will not see Lincoln being mentioned anywhere. Okay, Whitman doesn't directly say this poem is for Lincoln, but this is considered across the world, this is considered as an elegy for Lincoln. Okay. So why do we think that it's an elegy for Lincoln? What Whitman does is he uses a series of imagery and symbols. Okay. Like he uses the imagery of or symbols of lilacs, a drooping star, and then he starts with grief and moves towards an acceptance and knowledge of death. So the poem starts with grief, saying that somebody died and this and that and everything. And then as you reach the end, it kind of the mood changes to acceptance and knowledge of death. So he basically says, well, the person has died. So I mean, there's nothing I can do about it. So I will accept it and move on. Now, all this can be related to Lincoln's death. So that is how we know that it's an elegy for Lincoln, even though Whitman doesn't, like I said, specifically say it. Now, he also makes references in the poem because it's a huge poem. He also makes references to the Civil War and then which kind of ended just days before Lincoln was assassinated. So just before Lincoln died, the Civil War ended. Anyway, these three symbols are important in the poem. Okay, the lilacs first. Lilac is a form of or a type of flower. Okay, what do those represent? They represent the love that Whitman has for Lincoln. Okay, that's the symbolism. Lilacs represent the love that Whitman has for Lincoln. Then there is another symbol, the fallen star. The fallen star is the president itself, who is Lincoln. And then there's a bird. There's a bird called hermit thrush. Okay, this is another symbol. This is a small bird, and then, sound that this bird makes is very soothing and very pleasant to ears. Okay, so that's another symbol, and this represents death. Okay, I'll repeat this. There are three very important symbols in this poem. One is the lilacs that represent the love that Whitman has for Lincoln. Then there's the fallen star, which refers to Lincoln himself. And then there's the hermit thrush, which is a small bird. The hermit thrush represents death. Okay. Any questions on this so far? On Whitman's style of writing before we move on to Dickinson? Yeah, we'll go on to Dickinson. Let me check the chat if somebody has questions. Okay, please give me few seconds. I just need to very quickly do something. Oh. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, it seems like there are no questions on Whitman. We'll move on to Dickinson then. Now, she's another poet of the 19th century. If I was talking about Whitman and then how peculiar his writing is, Emily Dickinson beats him by a long shot. Emily Dickinson is peculiar in tons of ways. I mean, she's very peculiar in many ways. She, for one thing, she lived most of her life in isolation. She didn't meet anybody. She didn't have any guests. She didn't have anybody coming to her. And the very few friends that she had, she was known to talk to them from behind a screen. Okay, she never met them personally. Later in her life, she was confined to her bedroom by choice. Okay, it's not like, somebody tied her to the bed or anything. She was confined to her bedroom by choice. She never met anybody. Dickinson never married, and most of the friendships between her and others dependent entirely upon letters she wrote to them. Like I said, nobody came and actually met her. Very few people came and met her, and to them also, she didn't show her face. Now, if you think that's peculiar, her writing style is even more peculiar. One of her famous, basically, quotes, this kind of sums up Dickinson, in my view, is she says, "Pardon my sanity in a world that is insane." Okay, so she thinks the world is insane, and then she's sane, and she basically says, "Pardon my sanity in a world that is insane." Okay, that's one of the most famous quotes of Dickinson, and I think that kind of sums up what Dickinson is. Okay, she did not publish much during her lifetime, but her poems became famous after she died. She wrote about, like, I think, close to 2,000 poems, half of which are on topics like birthdays, Valentine's, love, funerals, death, all these kind of themes. Now, her poems contain very short lines. They typically don't have any titles. She used like dashes at unconventional places. And then she used capitalization at weird places in the poem. In the middle of the line, she would use capitalization. So she would do these very unconventional poetic things. Her punctuation didn't follow the conventional rules. She would have a comma somewhere. She would have a full stop somewhere. She would have a dash somewhere. So all in all, everything related to Dickinson is very peculiar. Now, she, again, experienced death of a family member when she was early, and then she died at a young age too. She died when she was 55 or 56, something like that. She died very young. Okay. Coming to her poetry style, like I mentioned earlier, she used dashes extensively. The dash is on your screen, and very unconventional capitalization. One such poem is on your screen, where she has these dashes at the most unconventional places, even at the end of the last line. If you see the poem on your screen, There's a dash at the end of the last line. That's the last line of the poem. What is the dash doing there? Right? It's very unconventional for her to put it there. Okay, if you look at the poem, she basically says, I'll read it out. Much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye. Much sense, the starkest madness. 'Tis the majority in this, as all prevail. Assent, and you are sane. Dimmer, you're straightway dangerous and handle with a chain. Okay, that's a very short poem that she wrote. What is she saying in this poem? A lot of the things that people consider crazy are actually completely normal and rational. That is what she's saying. If people are willing to look at the world objectively, what she says is, what Dickinson says is, if you can look at the world objectively, then whatever you think is really crazy, most of the people think are really crazy, are actually natural and completely normal and rational. In the same way, what's considered normal and sensible is completely crazy. Now, this is a kind of sort of a philosophical tint to it, but that is what Dickinson is sort of saying in this poem. Why is she saying that? That's because majority opinion always wins, is her opinion. Okay, basically she says if a lot of people start doing something, then everybody will start doing something. Okay, from tomorrow, if we all do, I mean, or majority of us do something, then the minority will also start doing the same thing. That is what she says. She says if you agree with societal norms, if you see the last but two sentences, assent and you are sane, dimmer, you're straight away dangerous. That's what she says. She's saying if you disagree with these societal norms, then you're immediately seen as a threat and you're chained up. Okay. Now, Dickinson here is talking about sanity and insanity, of course. But the poem is also asking its readers to not take society's ideas about madness, sense, what is right, what is wrong, what is rational, what is irrational, what is good, what is bad. She's basically saying don't take all these at face value. Instead, you think for yourself whether it's really mad or not. Don't go with the flow. Don't go with the majority of the people. That's what Dickinson is basically, or this poem is basically trying to say. Now, but the poem also says this is not easy to do. It's not saying it is very easy. From tomorrow, you only start wearing pink shirts. She's not saying that. Okay. She's just because you want to. She's saying it's not also that easy to do this. Why? Because the society will change you. Or chain you basically doesn't mean they will always chain you, but they resist change. Anyway, if you look at the punctuation, you will know that this is very peculiar. She has dashes all over the place. All the lines have dashes. Some lines have dash in the middle. There are other poems listed in your book. So please take the time to read the unit. You will understand that this is a strange way of writing poetry. But she was a heavily successful writer, but only after her death. Okay, any questions on Dickinson's writing style so far? No? Okay. Just like we discussed Whitman, we will see like what themes Dickinson wrote on. Dickinson was writing about, I think I mentioned these before, but nature, death, God, salvation, damnation, hell, heaven, prayer, these things. These things were very commonly used as themes in her poems. She also had nature, like flowers, gardens, showing up in her poems a lot. Okay, this is all very good, but why are we talking about Whitman and Dickinson in particular? There were a lot of poets, lot of writers during during that time period. But why are we specifically taking out Whitman and Dickinson? If you notice, Whitman's writing style and Dickinson's writing style, you will immediately know that they don't have anything in common also. They are very peculiar writers. So why are we talking about what is the linking line or the thread that links these two people? It's transcendentalism, but let me put it in a different way. First, let me summarize what the differences are. These two poets have different styles, like I said. Whitman used long lines in his poems. Dickinson used very short lines. Whitman's poems were long in length. The poems themselves, I mean, if you remember, the poem that we discussed was 206 lines in length. And Dickinson's is what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines hardly. Okay. What links these two people is the philosophy of transcendentalism or their connection to Emerson in a specific way. This is very evident in the theme of nature. If you see, nature is a theme in Dickinson's poetry as well as Whitman's poetry. Anyway, these two poets can be said to be representative of two major American poetic ways, the free verse from Whitman and direct emotional expression. Okay. And when you come to Dickinson, it's the irony of life and then how good and bad are defined by the society and such. Okay. So both of these people had a tremendous impact on the 20th century American poetry. They had tremendous influence of transcendentalism on them. And then they in turn had a tremendous impact on the 20th century American poetry. Okay, before going on to the next block, what is Whitman's contribution to poetry can be one of the questions that can come from this unit. And it is there directly in unit 10 of your course book. So this is a direct question. And then describe 5 recurrent themes in Dickinson's poetry. I just mentioned them in the previous slide. Nature, death, God, prayer, hell and heaven, salvation, damnation, all these are themes. So this is also there in unit 11, which talks about Dickinson and her poetry. Okay, any questions on this unit? Any questions on their styles? Any questions on anything else that relates to this unit? Okay. Pujita says no, sir. Shweta, I'm sorry, I missed your previous comment. You're saying, is it related to Bhagavad Gita? What is related to Bhagavad Gita? Can you please explain? Okay, we'll come back to Shweta's comment when she responds, but let's move on.
Excuse me, sir.
Yeah, Hina.
It's their themes now. Nature, dreams, death, and
It's, sorry, repeat the question, please.
it's mentioned their themes.
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, we have to give brief explanation about this. Nature, death, private life. No, just we have to write these words only.
Good question. Good question. Okay. So my answer is it depends on what the question is asking. Okay. So if the question says, describe, like the second question on your screen, if it says describe 5 recurrent themes in Dickinson's poetry, and then it's a long answer question. Let's say it's a long answer question. Then you should write at least a paragraph on each of the themes. Like you can say nature or good and bad. Let's take that as a theme. And then you will say that Dickinson poetry has good and bad. And then in this particular poem, the one that we just discussed, she talks about good and bad and then how, society influences good and bad and all that stuff. Okay. But if it's a short answer, and then if it just says describe 5 recurrent themes in Dickinson's poetry, I would cut short. I would still write a couple of lines for each of those themes, but I wouldn't, expand it to a paragraph or two. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you, sir.
Sure. So please understand what the question is asking, okay? Because most times what happens is, as students, what we do is we look at the question, and then the minute we see Dickinson, we will start off with Dickinson's mental problems, Dickinson this, Dickinson that, she was born here, she was born there, that kind of stuff. But if the question itself is only asking about recurrent themes, I urge you to stick to recurrent themes, not to Dickinson's personal life, okay? But if the question says, let's say, what is Whitman's contribution to poetry? Now, Whitman's contribution to poetry is influenced by his life, right? What happened in his life, that influences his poetry, right? So in that case, it would be okay to write an introductory paragraph on Whitman's life and then say Whitman experienced this, and then Lincoln died, and Whitman was very fond of Lincoln, and that's why he wrote the 206 lines poem.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Sure. Okay. Okay, Shweta says poem on Lincoln. Doesn't have anything to do with Bhagavad Gita. It's about, oh, you mean elegy is Bhagavad Gita? I'm not sure what the question is, Shweta, but we'll come back to your. Oh, okay. No, an elegy is not like Bhagavad Gita. Bhagavad Gita is a religious text, and it's not an elegy to anybody. Elegy basically means, let's say, one person dies, and then the friend or a poet or poetess or whoever it is writes a poem on that dead person in remembrance of that dead person. That's an elegy. Okay. So why is this an elegy? What Whitman has written an elegy is it's because Lincoln, who was the US president, he died, and then Whitman wrote a poem in remembrance of Lincoln. That makes it an elegy. Okay. Okay. Good. Let's move on to. Okay, now we've seen 19th century poetry. Let's slowly come to the 20th century. We are now in the modernist era. Okay, the early 20th century is called modernist era. Now we are talking about people like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound. These two were extremely famous during the early 20th century. They outright rejected the traditional poetic form. They said, forget about the form, forget about the meter, all these traditional ways of representing these. They don't make any sense. Now you'll have to understand, again, I will go back to my point about literature reflects society. Early 20th century was riddled with World War One. Okay, so these poets or any poet or writer for that matter, they didn't like ornamentation and all at that time. They were like, okay, fine, ornamentation and all is fine, but the reality is something else. The reality is people are dying in war. So let's stick to reality and then forget about the form, meter, and traditional forms and meters. Let's just reflect reality in our work. So that's the attitude of writers in the starting of the 20th century. Now, later there were poets like Robert Frost. He's the most famous. I'm pretty sure all of us have heard about who or know who Robert Frost is. Then there's Wallace Stevens. Then there's Marianne Moore, E. E. Cummings, and then John Crowe Ransom is a new critic. Are you having literature criticism classes? I think that's one of your papers, right? Literary criticism.
Yes.
The
Okay.
classes are not going on, sir.
Okay. Okay. So does anybody know what new criticism is? Whoever is present in this class, do you know what new criticism is? Or else I'll very quickly
Yes,
explain new
sir.
criticism. Okay, good. What is new criticism?
So new critics believe that we have to take the art form like poetry or whatever just for the sake of it and not go into details like the author's background or whatever, like other stuff that usually old critics used to do.
Okay, old critics. Okay, I like that phrasing, but yes, you're right. Does everybody understand what, Samira, was that you? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Yes, yes, sir.
Okay, okay. Does anybody have any questions on what Samira just said? Or do we all understand what new criticism is? This is a very important phase in literary theory and literary criticism. So you will read about it in your literary criticism book, I'm sure. But like just Samira said, it's basically a way that emphasized close reading of a work of literature or any art form, like she said, basically as self-contained work. What does that mean? The structure and meaning of the text are closely connected and they should not be analyzed separately. Like they should exclude reader response, they should exclude author's intention, they should exclude historical, cultural context. Everything should be excluded. What they basically say is whatever you have to know about a piece of work is there in the work itself. Okay, from a literary perspective or from a poem or a prose perspective, basically what they said is the words on the page were all that mattered. Getting meanings from outside the text was completely irrelevant and it's distracting, and then it shouldn't be done. They said all you need is on the page in front of you. If you read the page in front of you, the meaning is there inside the page. You shouldn't be going outside the page for analyzing any text. Okay, Asad says analyzing literature based on text alone. Yes, that's exactly what is new criticism. You shouldn't consider any external factors. Okay. Your course book talks about Wallace Stevens and Robert Frost. Stevens started poetry very late in his life, so his poetry is considered a little mature. It's not the typical poetry of somebody who would start writing in their teens or 20s or 30s and then matures over a period of time. Stevens started writing poetry late in his life, so his experience and everything kind of created a matured level of poetry. He was not a full-time poet. He was an insurance agent. So he wrote all poetry, prose, and I think he wrote one play also. But anyway, his specialty is that he uses very difficult words in his poetry and imagery also. It is not very apparent. Like if you see Frost, we will talk about Frost in a bit, but if you see Frost, Frost is very simple. I mean, he has very simple lines, he's like kind of Ernest Hemingway of the poetry. Okay, straightforward imagery is there, but then the imagery is not that difficult to understand, at least in the first glance. Stevens is exactly opposite. Stevens writes poems or used to write poems which are, you look at the poem and then you have no clue what he's talking about unless you actually analyze the poem. Okay, we will take one of his poems and then I will try to prove this point. It's, I think, there on page 138 in your book. I don't have your book with me. So if anybody has the book, can somebody please read the poem? It's called Anecdote of the Jar. Does anybody have the book in front of them? If you have the book in front of you, please, anybody, can you please volunteer to read what the poem is?
Sir, what's the page number?
I think it's in 138. Can you check 136 and 138? I think it's in 138, Samira. Just check.
Anecdote
called,
of the jar.
140.
Okay, yes, it's
140,
called
sir.
Anecdote of the Jar. It's called Anecdote of the Jar. Samira, can you just read out? It's not a big poem.
Okay. I placed the jar in Tennessee, and round it was upon a hill. It made the slovenly wilderness surround that hill. The wilderness rose up to it and sprawled around, no longer wild. The jar was round upon the ground and tall and of a boat in air. It took dominion everywhere. The jar was grey and bare. It did not give of bird or bush, like nothing else in Tennessee.
Okay, that's a good reading, by the way. I mean, you're a much better poetry reader than I am. Now, does this make any sense to anybody? Samira just read the poem. What is the poet trying to say here? What is Wallace Stevens saying here? Any ideas? If you look at it for the first time, this poem shouldn't make any sense to most of us unless we have, very good analytical skills and, we already know multiple interpretations of this poem. What this poem actually, oh, I'm sorry, hold on for one second. We still have time, right? What time is it? The class is until 1:15, right?
We still have half an hour, sir.
Okay. Yeah. Now what Stevens is saying here is this poem, through this poem, he talks about the relationship between humans and the natural world. And in particular, man's desire to, mess up with the structure of its environment. Okay. How man comes and then pokes his finger in nature's way of doing things, and then he messes it up. That is what he's talking about. Now, if you see, the Anecdote of the Jar is the title of the poem. Now, the jar is clearly out of place, right? What is it doing in the middle of wilderness? If you see the first or second line, um, he says the jar is in wilderness or something. I placed a jar in Tennessee and round it was upon a hill. What on earth is a jar doing on top of a hill? Now, that's the imagery that what Stevens is trying to construct. But the jar is clearly out of place. Now, if you see how this is set, it is just a jar in the middle of a rural Tennessee. Tennessee is a state in US. Now, maybe the poem is about the rigidity of modern life, or maybe it's about man's desire to, like I said, mess up with nature and by placing a man-made object in the middle of wilderness. Okay. There's wilderness all around, and then, there's a jar in the middle. Now, if you see the line, it took dominion everywhere. What does that mean? This is probably referring to how human society literally dominates everything, including the environment. So this probably is the way of the poet to tell us that, man is messing up with nature. Now, it may be saying that the jar somehow brings in order to chaos in the wilderness, because wilderness is, it has chaos, and then jar somehow brings some order in this wilderness. Now, you can interpret this in many ways. Again, I will bring the same point that there is no right or wrong interpretation of a piece of art. It is just an interpretation. That's it. It's an individual interpretation. Someone might agree with your interpretation and some people might not agree with your interpretation. That doesn't make it wrong. Okay, right or wrong. We can have different interpretations. But the point here that I'm trying to make is not different interpretations or something, but the point here is that Wallace Stevens uses very strange and like bizarre imagery to get across his point. He doesn't have to use a jar. He doesn't have to use, put it on the top of hill in Tennessee. He doesn't have to do all this, but that is his way of doing it. Like I said, his poems are a little complicated and there are multiple interpretations and very matured poems also. Okay. Okay. Now let's move on to one of the most famous poets of the 20th century. We will move on to Robert Frost. Frost is again like great poets and authors. Most great authors and poets they have horrible lives actually. Their personal lives are.
So may I interrupt you once, please?
Of course. Yeah.
I'm just wondering with the new critical thinking, how does the poem fall into those lines? Like, when something else is in the text and something has to be analyzed to understand what actually the writer is wanting to tell us. So just, trying to understand how does this fall? So does it not contradict? I mean, just wondering.
Does it not contradict what? Rebecca, I missed that last part.
Does it not contradict the new critical thinking? I'm just wondering, how does that kind of an understanding work with these kinds of poems when analysis has to be done by the reader?
Right. So new critical thinking is only a form of thinking. Okay. So these interpretations that I just talked about in the anecdote of the jar does not, you're right, it doesn't fall into new critical thinking. If I was a new critic, then I would just read the poem and then I would interpret only based on my knowledge of what I read, nothing apart from that. So you're right. Multiple interpretations of a poem by the same person include subjectivity, right? It's not an objective interpretation of the poem. So the reading that I just did is not new critical or it doesn't align with the new critical thinking. We were talking about new criticism when we were talking about John Crow Ransom. That was one of the poets that was listed. He was the one who coined the term, actually, John Crow Ransom and other guy, Alan Tate, I think. These were the two people who coined the term new criticism. Okay, so it's just a form of analyzing a poem or a piece of art. The one that we just did is not new criticism. We were talking about Stevens' style of writing and then.
So this does not work for every piece of art, right? Or every piece of poem or whatever it is. It does not work.
Okay. Let me put it this way. If you ask a new critic, then he or she will say it will work for every piece of art. If you ask a non-new critic, then they will say, yes, it doesn't work. Why? Because new criticism, like I said, believes in one core tenet, which is everything that you have to understand is there on the page, nothing else. You cannot bring in Wallace Stevens' personal life as an insurance broker. You cannot bring in, the wilderness of Tennessee, nothing. Your idea of Tennessee or something will not play any part in understanding the poem. So if you actually ask a core new critic, then he or she will say, what is there? I mean, anecdote of the jar, and then Stevens has written some lines. Just excuse me, interpret those based on those lines. That's it. Don't bring in Stephen's life, your life, reader's response, nothing. So that is the answer you will get if you ask a core new critic. Now, if you ask anybody who doesn't believe in or who is not a core new critic, then they will say, of course, Rebecca, I mean, when there's a poem and then you have subjectivity built into it as a reader, of course, our interpretations are going to be different, right?
Yeah.
So it depends on who you're asking.
Right. So, but according to the new critics, I think it doesn't make sense at all. The poem doesn't make sense at all if you just read the text and leave it there, right?
Yes. But they will come with some interpretation, right? Basically,
Okay. So,
what
but
they will
still
say
there is
is,
an interpretation. But still
right,
there is an interpretation.
true. And
Right.
then that is what they are saying. There is still an interpretation. They are
Yeah.
saying, see, basically, when I said, what is a jar doing in the middle of a hill or on top of a hill, right? A new critic would say, Ashwin, it doesn't matter. Don't think about it as, why is there a jar in the middle of Tennessee, in the middle of a hill? It doesn't matter. Stevens is telling you there is a jar, there is a jar. That's it.
Okay.
Okay, so don't bring in your subjectivity. That's what a new critic would say. Okay, if Stevens would have meant something else, then he would have told. That's
So,
what
what
a
is
new
the
critic would say.
standard? Like, what is the standard? I would go with some other interpretation. There should be a standard where I need to follow and fall into somewhere where I need to fit in, right? To understand what it is. What is the actual standard, sir?
Exactly. There is no standard. And like I'll go back to Dickinson. The standard is what the majority of the people agree with.
I see.
But then if you ask Dickinson, she will say that's crazy. Right? So that's the whole point. You bring in a very important and a very good point, which is when it comes to literature, there is no right or wrong interpretation. We all have our interpretations, and where you fit in depends on, which group you align with. Like if I say whatever is there on the page is what is the meaning of the poem, then I'm aligning with new criticism. Okay, if I say, wow, Stevens is talking about nature, he's talking about this and everything, then I'm aligning with the romantic, way of thinking.
Yeah.
Okay, if I'm talking about, wilderness, leaves, and, a trunk has fallen down, whatever, in a realistic way, then I'm aligning with realism. Right? So there is no one interpretation of anything, not just poem. See, that's the thing. And we will see it. I mean, don't lose that thought, okay? Keep it at the back of your mind. We will see that there can be multiple interpretations of a very simple poem from a very simple or simplistic writer like Robert Frost. We will see that in a few minutes, okay? Hold on to that thought.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? That's a very good question, Rebecca. Thanks. Any other questions, guys? Okay. Let's move on to Robert Frost. I am not sure if we'll finish with Robert Frost today, but we will try and then wrap it up. Okay. His, like I said, like all most great authors, their lives, personal lives are kind of sort of horrible. They have tremendous loss and then they have experienced bad things in their life. Frost's personal life was also filled with loss. His father died when Frost was a child. His mother died of cancer. Mental illness ran in Frost's family. His sister was in a mental hospital for a long time and then she later died. Frost himself he was suffering from depression. So all along, there are mental issues in Frost's family and himself also. But that is his personal family, the personal details. But coming to Frost as a poet, he is a different kind of poet. Now, how is he different? He used simple language, especially when comparing with Stevens. He used simple language to talk mostly about the rural life in New England, even though his language is simple. Now, okay, I'll have to make a distinction here. I am calling his language simple. Okay, I'm not saying he talked about simple stuff. Okay, he talked about very complex stuff. Again, like I said, he's the Ernest Hemingway of poetry. Hemingway also, we when we were talking about him, we realized that now this guy is talking in a very simple language, but what he is talking about is not that simple. He's talking about complex social things. Similar way, Frost also, even though his language is simple, he uses it to examine very complex social and philosophical themes. Okay, he's not talking about simple things. He's just talking about them in a simple way. That's it. Okay. Frost is also special because he's the only poet to receive 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry. Okay, Pulitzer Prize is a very coveted prize. He's the only poet so far to release or receive 4 Pulitzer Prizes. He was very well respected in his lifetime. He's not like, somebody like Edgar Allan Poe, who didn't have huge success in their lifetime, or Dickinson for that matter, who only got recognition after their death. Frost was respected during his lifetime, and all his work got a lot of recognition, and that's probably why we all know who Frost is. Okay. From a themes perspective, Frost wrote about everyday life, human contact with nature, love, isolation, life's struggles. His style was very conversational and realistic. It's not, filled with, complicated words and complicated um, punctuation and everything. We will take one of his most famous poems and talk about it. Actually, you know what? Let's take two. One we will take today, and then tomorrow we will take one more. The first poem is in your book. I think it's page 148. Samira, because you are our poetry reader, can you go to 148 and read this poem, Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening?
Yes, sir. Give me a minute.
Yeah. Take your time.
— 148. Stopping by the woods?
Yes, Stopping by the Woods.
Stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods are these are? I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near. Between the woods and frozen lay the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep.
Okay, good reading again. And most famous lines of this poem are the last two lines, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Now, on the surface, I think most of us have read this poem or we have heard about this. It is part of many English textbooks in 7th, 8th, 9th grades. So anyway, on the surface, this poem is very simple. The speaker is stopping by some woods on a snowy evening. He or she looks at the lovely scene very silently. He or she is tempted to stay longer, but then also thinks of their responsibilities before he or she can rest for the night. That is the typical interpretation, what Rebecca was mentioning about. And then we will say this is the standard interpretation. Okay. Do you all agree that this is the standard interpretation? There's a speaker stopping by some woods. He or she looks at the lovely scene. He or she is tempted to stay longer, but then they suddenly remember about their responsibilities before she can rest. So she or he says, miles to go before I sleep. But is this the only interpretation? As we have seen a few minutes ago, and multiple times, in fact, during these classes, literature can be interpreted in different ways, and this poem is not an exception. On the surface, it is a poem that describes a snowy evening. Now, there have been other interpretations. Again, these are not my interpretations. There have been other interpretations by critics and thinkers and, poetry analyzers. Some critics think that death is a major theme in this poem. When you look at the poem, is he talking about death anywhere? He's not talking about death anywhere. In fact, when you read it for the first time, you would think that this is a poem that is about life, not about death. Somebody is realizing that they have responsibilities and, he or she is saying, miles to go before I sleep. But this is another interpretation by critics that say death is the major theme in this poem. Some think that Frost is talking about suicide in this poem, not just natural death. Okay, someone has interpreted, not someone, I mean, a few people have interpreted it in this way, This is just one viewpoint, okay? We are not saying that this is the standard interpretation. We are just saying this is one interpretation in many interpretations that we can have on a simple poem like this. One viewpoint again is that the narrator is thinking about suicide. Why are they saying this? Because of the phrases like, darkest evening of the year, frozen lake, dark and deep. These are the phrases and words that people have interpreted in a different way. And then they say this is what brings in that eerie suicide into the interpretation. Okay. Of course, in the end, the narrator does realize that he cannot die yet because he has miles to go before he sleeps. So they say, oh, well, he or she is contemplating death, but then in the end they realize, and then, they don't go through with their plan. So again, you can see how small, simple poem can be interpreted in different ways. Okay. Now, going back to Rebecca's point, Rebecca, you see how, a simple poem like this can also be interpreted in different ways, but unfortunately, there is nothing called a standard interpretation. Now, the standard interpretation is the interpretation that majority of the people agree with, which is what I just mentioned, right? I mean, somebody is there and then, they are
Yes.
just, so it's a very interesting thing that happens with, especially with poems, because, poems have this, are loaded with imagery and then, a lot of ornamentation, let me put it that way, like metaphors, similes, hyperboles. These are so filled into the poems that it is impossible to have one interpretation. The interpretation that everybody agrees or majority of us agree with, that's the standard interpretation. That's it. Okay. Okay. Any questions? If not, we will go to the next poem of Frost. There's a small but very famous poem called Road Not Taken. This one is also a poem that can be interpreted in different ways. Again, while the language is simple, this is the stamp of Robert Frost, simple language. What it represents, what it symbolizes is considered to be very complex. Okay. I am not sure which page this poem is in. Can anybody tell everybody else what page this is in? It's called The Road Not Taken. Should be in the chapter that talks about Frost. Samira, you still have the book in your hand?
Yes, sir, I'm checking.
Okay. Should be somewhere right after, the previous one, Snowy Evening.
I think it's not given, sir. Some other poems are given, like the birches,
Oh, okay. Yeah, the Birches was
apple
there.
picking, all those things.
Okay, that's fine. We are anyway at the top of the hour. So I'll very quickly tell you what this poem is about, and then we can discuss in case you have any questions. Okay. 153, Rajani says 153. Can you just check once? It starts with two roads diverged in a yellow wood. That's how it starts.
The walking is there, sir.
Or
The walking is
Right.
in Robert Frost chapter. It's not given, sir.
Oh, okay. Okay. I must be mistaken then. Okay. Anyway, we'll talk about it a little bit. Does everybody know, or do most of you know what this poem is about? It's about two roads, and then, the road less traveled. He ultimately takes the road less traveled, and then he says that has made all the difference. Okay. That's how the poem is. Okay. I can't read the poem. You can Google it, and then it's a pretty famous poem. So just Google it, and then you can read it in your free time. But what is Frost saying here? That's the main point. On the surface, again, looks like he's saying follow your own path, because again, the last two lines are the most famous lines of this poem. And then they go, I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. He's basically saying there are two roads. and then one is, little grassy and then not used, and the other one is very used, and then he takes the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. What difference it has made, we actually don't know. Okay. But if you look at it on the surface, it looks like he's saying follow your own path, and then whatever happens happens. There is always choice of two paths in your life, so take one path and then take your own path, and then that's it. But is this what he is really saying? Again, there can be multiple interpretations. Again, a new critic, again going back to Rebecca's point, new critic might not agree with this, not might not, he or she will not agree with this. But Frost wrote this poem as a joke for his friend. His friend's name is Edward Thomas, who was a British poet. I think you will talk about him in your British course. But Frost and Thomas were going on these walks every day, and Thomas was very indecisive about which route to take. He would be like, one day, you'll go this side, you'll go this side, you'll go this side. But whenever they used to go walking, Thomas used to basically say, whichever way we go, we are sure to miss something good on the other path. It is like, the grass is greener on the other side kind of thing, where wherever you go, you have these two choices, and then you take the one choice and then immediately regret taking that choice and then say, oh, I should have taken the other one. Maybe that is better. Now, Frost, in fact, he himself called this poem very tricky. So on the surface, it looks very simple, but so he himself said that there are hidden meanings in the poem. Thomas was very keen literary thinker of his time, okay? And this poem is talking about his behavior of indecisiveness, but he himself couldn't figure it out. So he basically says he traveled the road less traveled. Whatever the actual meaning is, if there can be an actual meaning, in fact, our learning is that there can be multiple ways in which this poem can be interpreted. I just wanted to bring that out. Now, I have a very interesting clip that Ford, the car company Ford, they have used it as their ad. Okay, we are going to you know what? Let me download it and then I will show it to you tomorrow. Okay, in tomorrow's class. How about that? And we'll start with that clip and then we will go to block 3, if that's okay with everybody. Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. Very quickly recap questions then. Who wrote Leaves of Grass? Anybody? Leaves of Grass was written by Walt Whitman. Anyway, what is new criticism? We have discussed it at length. We all know what new criticism is. If you want more details, please look at your literary criticism textbook or course book, and that will have more details about it. Then name one poem of Robert Frost. We looked at 2. And there are others also listed in your book, like Samira and others were saying. Birches is one, After Apple Picking, The Walking. And then we talked about Walking by the Woods on a Snowy Evening. And then we also talked about The Road Not Taken. I'm not sure why Road Not Taken is not there in the book. But anyway. Okay, we will take a break here and we will continue in the next class. In the next class, like I said, we'll start with a clip that Ford has used for the Road Not Taken poem. And then we will talk very quickly about what it means. And then we will move on to American drama. This is a short block. The American drama piece is a short block because American drama has not had this vast history when compared to poetry or fiction. Poetry or fiction started much, much, much earlier than drama on the American side. Okay. We will start with the characteristics of American drama. Then we will move on to two, again, very great dramatists, Eugene O'Neill and Arthur Miller. We'll talk about other contemporary dramatists like Tennessee Williams and Edward Albee. We will talk, in specific, we will talk about these 4 people, but that's all in the next class. Okay. If you don't have any questions, then I will let you go. Thank you for joining the class today, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Okay. If you don't have any questions, you're welcome to log off.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Sure.